3PO's all CG here, and the background and everything CG. For this sequence, the way I really wanted to get a sense of different places in the factory, and so each area had a different feel. The machines were different and the lighting was different. This is more of a neutral sort of fluorescent type lighting, just to really make it clear to everyone, okay, we're in this part of the factory now and we're in the other part. A lot of the look of the factory was greatly enhanced by Marshall Cruster's compositing team, because they added all these dust elements, but we, you know, placed with a sort of almost like a Lego toolkit. We called it Lego. It's like a Meccano toolkit, or a way of making a model train tracks of the conveyors in the background. So we got all of this background action and just built up layers and layers of action in the factory. The foundry here was another miniature with the cauldrons and the smelting machine that you just saw as computer graphics, and of course R2's computer graphics as well. We shot a sort of goopy methacil, backlit methacil element to get the glowing hot molten metal feel. This scene was pretty tricky. I think we struggled a little bit with what was going on here.
We did. There's a lot of back and forth with George on the speed of the conveyor, the number of cutters, what was happening with his arm being pinned down. I remember lots of edits going back and forth.
In this case, we did a lot of work on the miniature later to add smoke elements, and we changed the color of it, and we shot multiple passes of the miniature to allow interactive lights from all the hot molten metal that's going around everywhere. So, you know, it's quite tricky. Some of the miniature work itself, it creates problems. Like this shot here is, we had to shoot in multiple passes because the camera move was so extreme. It was very difficult to nail that down. And then we had to tie it into the original photography of Padme falling out. So this section here was where we had a lot of problems just working out how all the different choppers would work. And we, you know, after we'd done the first pass, we added some shots of that later on to try and make it more clear what's going on, and Anakin's lightsaber's being chopped. In the shot coming up, we cut back to the factory set here, and those great Geonosians. Double of Django. Originally there was a blue screen, but because he had to do such a jump, and Rob was game to do it as a digital double shot, we decided to try it and he's a CG guy.
6 begins the climax of the movie in many ways. Reel 6 traditionally in Star Wars is that 20 minutes of continuous climactic action which caps off the drama. And it's marked editorially by several parallel battles or stories all taking place at once, and you're intercutting back and forth between them. It's also the point where any restraints on sound and music are let go, and you almost have 100% dialogue, 100% sound effects, and 100% music from now until the end of the reel. And this is always the biggest challenge for us, because not only is it the most difficult reel from a sound standpoint to pull off as being clear and articulate and you know, not just a wall of annoying sound, but also the opticals and special effects come in last on this scene because they're always left to the last moment, and this reel never is settled down editorially until the last minute, and we have to deal with changes.
Meeting with Doug Chiang, and he showed us that little mock-up that sat on the table. It was about 2 feet by 2 feet, and I remember looking into it and thinking, oh my gosh, how are we going to do this? And at that point, the stands were very geometric, meaning that the stands were kind of like what you think of a stadium that we go to. But when it came time for them to build it, George wanted it to be much more organic, as if the creatures who live on this planet had created this thing out of sort of secretions from their own body, or like a termite, or might build a big termite mound.
There were no two bleachers that were parallel to each other. It was a very organic sculptural shape. So trying to distribute creatures over the whole surface of the stadium was really challenging.
To the walks here and the flying, and I'm especially happy with how we were able to get some physical interaction. Watch how this Geonosian pushes Anakin up against the pole. It's those kind of moments that I'm always looking for. I really want the characters touching each other, because for you, the audience, I'm always thinking that it helps you believe that they're both in the same space. They really exist in that world. We always joked about who Poggle the Greater was. This is Poggle the Lesser. I loved his armor and his bangles he had on his wrists. He's the leader of all the Geonosians. Much in the tradition of Episode 1, when Boss Nass didn't really look like a Gungan and he was the leader of the Gungans, Poggle has this long tentacle beard that's simulated, much like how we do the clothing. Moves creatures. Clay, kind of like a big crab character. Dragon, snake kind. Just always love to work on big, scary creatures and certainly violent actions. This particular action of the Nexu ripping this character off of the Ore and then dragging him away, we always went back and forth on whether it was a little too over the top. We joked about, what a 9-year-old or a 13-year-old would want to see, and we all agreed that they'd want to see that. But I know George was sensitive to us not going too over the top.
It's an absolute nightmare for a lot of reasons. I mean, getting the lighting right, building the miniature. John Knoll just did a great job bringing this all together, because this is a really complex bit of action. We never had it totally storyboarded out. It was a work in progress for a long period of time. But getting all these different elements, having, literally all the background be digital. The only thing we shot here was a portion, I'd say about 6 feet high or 7 feet, were the poles, and we brought the sand into a blue screen stage, and everything else is digital.
Story and everything, this is not very complicated. Basically, it's a series of cliffhangers. The cliffhanger aspect of this is more like A New Hope, of Escape from the Death Star, where they go from one cliffhanger to another cliffhanger to another cliffhanger to another cliffhanger. And just when you think they're going to get it, they get rescued, and then they go and just about get it again and get rescued. So this is much more in the classic Saturday matinee style of cliffhangers.
Screening we had for just ourselves, just the editing crew and George, basically. We did it without any sound effects and music, because I felt that what we needed to see first was just the raw state of things. How well does the drama play as is? We know that sound effects and music are going to add greatly to it. But before we're distracted by that, we want to just evaluate where we are. So we've looked at the film, what we call naked. We're not naked, but the soundtrack is naked, the first time. And then after that, we begin to put in temporary sounds and temporary music and look at it in that way. And then you begin to see what role the music and sounds play.
In here that are homages to like Ray Harryhausen and other, classic fantasy, adventure, sci-fi, horror movies. You just have to keep your eyes open. Movie history.
There probably is an animator at ILM that hasn't been inspired by Ray Harryhausen's work. Ray worked on films like Seven Voyages to Sinbad and Mysterious Island, Valley of Guanji, and certainly love watching those movies still.
3 very distinctive creatures that would have different sounds, different feels. One is sort of like an elephant, one is sort of like a cat, and one is like a large crab. And they're very distinctive.
Also, the interchange between Obi-Wan and the Acklay. I love how the Acklay pulls the spear out, and then the effort to snap it in two. We'll put in actions like that. I originally thought that was just too broad, too comical, and George loved it, so it stays in the movie.
Finish her off!
We really contemplated a sequence this complex before, and it really is a function of using digital editing, using Videomatics, and great advances in ILM in terms of their animation capabilities. The complexity of some of these shots, and the fact that there's so many of them, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, just was not possible. We were learning on the last film. Phantom Menace was a large exercise in learning how to use this new digital technology on the scale that we were contemplating. And this is really the result of that experiment of the Phantom Menace. We're still learning even on this movie. We keep pushing the envelope, but it's not the same learning curve that we had to accomplish on Phantom Menace. Phantom Menace really went from 0 to 80. This one goes from 80 to 90. The fun part of being able to set up a character like Mace Windu and Sam wanting to do the pictures is that we were able to set him up in the first film and then actually use him in this film. And there wasn't really any place for him to do battle or anything in that one. Because ultimately everything is subservient to the story. And the plot was written 30 years ago and there's a certain story that has to transpire. When I set a character up, I can't just use a character because I want to use a character. I can put him in there and then he can grow into something in maybe the next movie, like this one with Sam Jackson, by making him, one of the Jedi Masters from the Jedi Council. When we get into here, where we have, which I knew would end up in this film, which was a massive Jedi fight, and obviously he can be one of the leaders of that, and I can really utilize him. And Sam, obviously, for him, that was what he wanted to do, but he had to put up with the little role in the first film in order to get to the bigger one in this one. And, and he's looking forward to the fact that he knows at the end of the Clone War he gets killed, so he has hopefully a great death scene. And, so you kind of know where everything's going, and you start with a little character. It's the same thing with Jimmy Smits, is an evolving character. He's hardly in this movie, but it's important that he be here so that he's established for the next movie where he actually gets to come into his own.
Same model from episode 1. They've been colored to match the Dionysus color scheme, so they're more red. Custom work was then added in as well for actions that we didn't have. And what we're able to do here in this sequence that we were never able to do in episode 1 is to really get into what's going on in the background of the shots. The little sub-fights or the little mini-fights. You can see in the background of all these shots, look for the lightsabers so you can see all the Jedi that they shot. Live-action Jedi that were pantomiming fighting with droids. We would animate them as little vignettes, which means we would take one element of a Jedi, animate 5 droids attacking it or fighting it. Some would die and some would fall down and some would be okay. And then John and his team take those little vignettes and layer them in to the backgrounds of wide shots like this.
That you'll see in the DVD and in the digital version, but not in the real version, which is that when the Reek stampedes over Jango, it wrecks his rocket pack. So there's little sparks in here and everything. And now I've added more sparks in. In the film version, these shots of Jango getting up and everything doesn't have sparks on it, but now they do. And you see at the very end of this sequence now, when he stands up, there's sparks there. And when Mace comes toward him, he tries to fire his rockets right there, and they don't work. Actually, you got these new shots in here. How'd you do that? I just did those yesterday, for God's sake.
The reason we did this is because we just had too much action where they were separated for too long. So George came up with this idea where the cart is overturned, they both get into it, and they have their little bit of dialogue, and we see them connected and still at the same time battling everything else that's going on.
We call this trying to find between real world physics and Star Wars physics that George talks about. Sometimes I think creatures like that fall too quickly, but to serve the story, George really feels that we need to make them have a heavy impact and be moving quicker than potentially we would be moving them. And we roll along pretty fast in these shots. These are pretty quick shots, and we're telling a lot of information here, and we're paying attention to the design. So we're figuring out where we want you to look. Even though it looks random, there's actually a great deal of time put into choreographing these shots. Thinning out the background behind the key action, but making it complicated and rich enough that you still feel that you're in the middle of a battle. One of the you may not think that we're thinking about is the gunfire on these droids. You'll see that the super battle droids have these rapid-firing guns on their right arm, with the destroyers with their guns, and then we have the battle droids with their blasters. We're actually thinking about what the sound is going to be like. Even though when we're animating this, we're animating silent. We don't know what the blaster sound is going to actually sound like until Ben Burt and his crew get involved. But we're thinking about how fast should we be firing these guns? Will it be just overwhelming for you as the audience? But here, see, watch how the guns click back into position. And that we're making sound effects ourselves, like the little. But we have no idea what Ben's going to do. They're up at Skywalker Ranch and we're at ILM, and it actually happens months or a year apart, easily, between when we're animating something and when it finally gets its production sound. So I'm always as surprised as you are, or interested as you are as audience, to hear the sounds that go into what we do.
We have the situation where everything builds up to the point where Luke's just about to be taken out by Vader, and Han Solo comes in and rescues him. In this one, we have the same thing where the Jedi are trapped, they're doomed, they're about to be destroyed, and Yoda comes in at the last second and saves them. So it's, again, the same idea interpreted and expressed in a different way.
Means when you're working with George and you just don't know where he comes up with this stuff. I take the same road to work that he does, and I just don't see any of this stuff. He comes in and the day starts off what if? What do you think if we did this? Every day you're faced with these new challenges because scenes that started off very small end up just huge, and you've got to be very, very flexible because in the end of the day, that's what our job is. Our job is to enable him to be able to achieve whatever it is he comes up with. And this sequence is a classic example of George coming up with stuff that just would not stop. It's sheer, relentless 30 minutes of absolute mayhem, and you just don't know where he gets this stuff.
I wanted to have this one little shot of Boba with his father's helmet because that's really the motivation of his character for all the other movies. Move on to the Clone War, which is the sort of ultimate in high action. It's the kind of battle that we'd always wanted to do in Star Wars, but I was never able to get a movie with a kind of dynamic, much larger canvas to paint on.
We wanted to try and keep some sort of anchor of reality. Really wanted to have some real photographic material. So the team of us went out to the southwest and shot a ton of images, about a couple of thousand images of different landscapes and that sort of thing for this. So we were able to shoot stills into tiles and make large panoramic versions for the background of these shots. And then we'd use the computer graphic terrain for all the flying shots and to marry the foregrounds and backgrounds together.
There was also a very cool idea, George's idea of the hologram of a war room in which, all the players are there. I mean, the good ones and the bad ones, and everybody's just taking a look at the theater and assessing, damages.
The clones a bit like stormtroopers, and it was a problem making sure it was clear to everyone that the clones are the good guys in this. So we put them in. Rob, you took somewhat gratuitous delight in the day that George decided he wanted to add clones in the back of all these ships.
Well, I think George really wanted to tie, as you can see in shots like this, the Jedi are clearly leading the clones, and the clones are the stormtroopers that we come to know later on. But we wanted to make sure that they were always associated with the Jedi. So there's shots of the clones just in behind Obi-Wan and Anakin inside the ships. And people may think that there were people in suits, but there was never, ever a clone trooper suit made. Every time you see them on screen, they're computer generated.
Yeah, I actually wanted to do a suit originally, this same idea of keeping it in, something in the element. And I sort of floated the question, I'd looked at a little bit, and in the end, when we said we want to add these guys in suits, I said, well, George, maybe now it's time to consider making the costume. And George sort of just looked at me and said, you know what, you just gave me a CG R2-D2, CG C3PO, they look great. The clones are going to look great. So all these shots of all the clones, all the clones in the suits that you see in the movie are entirely computer graphics.
There are literally thousands of clones in shots like this, all motion capture and animated. The huge vehicles, the terrain, it's all created inside the computer.
In my early imagination of Star Wars, this was one of the kinds of things I was thinking of. At that point, I couldn't even really contemplate. I could fantasize about it in my wildest imagination, but I couldn't even begin to think about including a sequence like this in a script. It just wasn't possible. But in the first burst of, this great kind of intergalactic war, this was the kind of sequences that I was thinking about, and then very quickly pared them down to a simple space battle on a Death Star, and eventually was able to, expand it to walkers and in rather controlled situations. But now I'm able to really cut loose and have all these action pieces be what I'd always hoped they'd be.
It wasn't till much later in the post-production process that George came up with the idea of the Death Star, and it made the whole process of trying to find Dooku much more important.
We had this sequence, and because we added it, I came up with the idea of adding a little schematic of the Death Star in here, because the Geonosians build robots and build things. They're sort of the construction workers. They would be the ones that would probably be contracted to build the Death Star. And they were the ones that Jay and Silent Bob worried that they got killed on the Death Star, but they are, after all, just a bunch of large termites.
So a very difficult shot because we had only about 2 weeks to do it and no set, absolutely none. So this is a very rough set, photographed and digitally painted. And then the Neimoidian ship was coming from episode 1, and people are green screen, and then Dooku is digital.
see there's a lot of elements that we added, the big smokes and that sort of thing, and a lot of destruction. And in the background here, you can see all the Wind in Yodas too, but you can see some of the still photographs that we'd taken.
These clone models were built to come right up close. You can see how they're all dirty and grunged up. That's done on purpose. We don't want them to look like computer graphics. We want them to look aged, and that they've been really in this battle.
We tried to give this whole battle a sense of realism by having sort of shaky cameras and zooms and all kinds of sort of rough photography, which gives you a lot of energy, but it's also on shots that are totally digital. I mean, they're not real at all. There is no camera involved. There is no shake. There is no zoom.
For the whole thing, we really wanted to get a very gritty and much more like modern combat films that you've seen in the last 10 years feel, as well as convey the epic scope of the battle. So we used a lot of handheld, shaky cam type stuff. We used a lot of smoke and elements going off, and then they used smash zooms and the sort of stuff that you see in combat photography to try and give that sense of a lot more gritty battle going on.
There isn't time!
We actually shot a big miniature set, and we'd shot it with a neutral colour and ended up going back and recolouring it because George felt it wasn't quite red enough to match the rest of Geonosis. It was tricky getting the materials for this set. We ended up using walnut shells to get a really fine-grained texture. Here we actually did some pretty amazing composite work where we took a shot of Padme rolling down a sand dune that we'd just shot at a quarry and replaced it with a miniature sand dune. So we'd had to match the original animation, shoot a motion control pass, and then replace it.
This scene with Padme falling out of the ship, when I originally wrote it and we cut it together, it didn't quite work. So in the editing process, I kept cutting it down until basically she falls out and they fly on. And we looked at it, and one of the assistant editors said, it really looks like something should happen there, and it doesn't. And so I said, well, I guess I didn't get away with this cutting it down, so what I'm going to have to do is reshoot it and add material to it to make it have more impact. So we reshot this scene with Hayden and Ewan, and really brought out the central issue, which was not in the first time I shot it, which was, if you go back, you'll be expelled from the Jedi Order. And that level of confrontation hadn't been there.
Dark, and we wanted to get the sense of the sun going down, and a lot of this is digital matte. These are big digital matte paintings using a lot of the photography that we'd shot in the Southwest and stitched together. Big simulation shot that Rob's team did, combined with a lot of the big pyro elements that we'd shot specifically. So all the explosions we'd shot for the Clone War sequence.
This was very difficult to do for lots of reasons. The set was actually only on the thing on the left side, and obviously the electricity CG and lightsabers. So as the camera is going around the characters, like for instance, that view is a blue screen.
Fight has now become a kind of Star Wars tradition. But what it does is it takes a general battle and makes it a very specific personal battle. And the challenge I had with this is I have to have 3 different fights, and I have to make them different. And I had to begin to show that Dooku had these powers similar to what the Emperor had. He has Sith powers, dark side powers. But they ultimately have to end up in sword fights. So we do a little bit of the Sith thing in the beginning to get rid of Anakin and let Obi-Wan have his fight. Then the whole thing about what happened to Padme was kind of shot in one of the later shoots too, because it was, I realized that we had lost her. Because I'm telling so many stories and doing so many things, and I just didn't think I could cut away from that sword fight to sort of deal with her. But then once I actually saw the movie, I realized that actually you want to see what happens to her, and you want her to end up, because before she just sort of ran at the end, but you want to know how she got there, and you need to tell that story.
A wonderful sequence where we really got to explore the ability of creating a CG double for Christopher Lee.
Wonderful actor as Christopher Lee is. When we shot this, he was 79 years old, and so the majority of these moves he couldn't really quite do. For some shots we had a stunt that will do the action, and then on top of that we replace the stunt double's face with Christopher Lee's face. And in some other shots we just replace him completely.
Sort of level 1 of the sword fight with Obi-Wan I then needed to progress to level 2 with Anakin, because each time we have a sword fight, it's got to get more intense and more intense. And so we came up with this idea of having Obi-Wan throw Anakin his sword so that he could fight with 2 swords for a little bit. And then I had Anakin cut a cable so I could do it in the dark. And I wanted to do a kind of go back to my old roots of a visual sequence, just a kind of a tone poem of lightsabers moving through dark and making it more of a visual idea than a action fighting idea.
Where you come from, this is one of the great introductions.
Master Yoda.
I saw this with an audience, was in London. When he starts to kick some serious butt, you cannot hear anything for about 5 minutes after the sequence is done. And you need a moment like this, because this is a moment that people have been waiting for. You know, obviously it was always going to be a very difficult sequence. How do you get, a 2.5 foot frogling to be fighting a 6'6" man? We never knew if it was going to work or not. And I think Rob did just such a exceptionally brilliant job in pulling it together, because it could have ended up completely ludicrous.
So the sequence in this movie that kept me up more nights, it was this sequence. Originally, as it's scripted, he came in right away and started fighting with his lightsaber. And John Knoll and Pablo Hellman and myself talked to George month after month about how we could make this real and believable. We felt that if we got into the fight too quickly, the audience would not be able to travel that distance from Yoda being an 800-year-old character and then being able to move around with such speed and being so nimble. So we talked to George about this, what we called the Wizard's Battle, and George added this into the sequence, and I think it really helps us as the audience travel with Yoda and find the inner strength and the energy to fight this evil Jedi Master, the Sith Lord.
To be very honest with you, I was scared to death of this sequence and how I was going to pull this off, because this was the biggest risk in the whole movie, was could I make this realistic enough to make it believable, or would it just be this most ludicrous joke? And so I was able to add the humor of him being an old man that became Superman and went back to an old man. I was able to have fun with it, but not make it look silly, which is what I was afraid was going to happen. But I was worried right up to the point where the animators showed me the shot where he walks in and looks tough. Suddenly, Yoda, in his acting and the way Frank Oz played it, I believe that this was a tough character that you have to watch out for. It's not a transition that you say, oh, give me a break. It's like, oh yeah, this is what we've been waiting for.
Why they emphasize when Yoda walks in, like he's really huffing and puffing.
Yeah.
And then when he okay, now it's showtime, I have to get the strength and energy to fight Dooku. He really, it's just this transition. He summons up all the energy, and I think that's a great moment.
The moment is how Yoda comes out of that fight, last shot, when we come back to him, and we see the exhaustion on his face, and we see him gather his energy up, much like he did after he lifts the ship out of the swamp in Empire. You see this moment right here. Resolved to what's happened, and he transforms back into that 800-year-old character, and walks towards his comrades.
Dooku solar sailor approaching Coruscant. In theory, a solar sail uses photon pressure to propel it, just like a sailing vessel out on the ocean. In practice, the sail that we've got is far too small to provide any real thrust.
But Watto's wings were too small to make him fly, and it still worked.
Star Wars.
Well, Star Wars physics, remember?
So, Taylor flies through a recognizable part of Coruscant and then heads towards this abandoned industrial district of Coruscant.
My favorite sequences, because as you see the solar sailor arrive, it's just about to enter this huge building. As it does so, you can just see Christopher Lee actually standing up in a chair and walking towards the exit.
This is actually a digital Count Dooku standing up and walking out of the solar sailor bubble. And it's going to cut to real Christopher Lee walking up the ramp of the full-size piece that was in Sydney, I guess.
We deal that Dooku is Darth Tyrannus, he's a Sith Lord, and that he's in league with Darth Sidious, and Darth Sidious is pulling all the strings, and everything is going just the way he wants them to go. The Emperor continues to pull the strings.
Everything is just
that you say Whiskey and Grady Coffer worked on, and I say last time that we see the Jedi Temple, and you can see that the whole movie turned towards a warm color, very saturated red, just to accentuate, the gravity of the situation when Obi thinks that they won and Yoda knows that they didn't win, that the war has started.
I agree.
The last sequence that takes place in the Jedi Temple, and the last shot that we see Yoda in this episode, and that this was an important acting moment for him. And the reason was because it was so subtle. If you watch what's going on in the eyes, and the eyebrows, and the ears, the attitude in this character is very, very important. George was very particular about this acting moment you're going to see in this last shot.
Star Wars, and probably continuing on with Close Encounters, and the many films which were born and grew up in this era of blockbuster summer movies. It was discovered early on that one way to give your film a fitting climax was to have the soundtrack be as deep and as rumbling and as much bass as possible. Rumble. And that rumble could be a ship taking off, or a ship landing, or the destruction of a world or a planet.
Beginning of the Empire right here. You can begin to see that this same ships and all this stuff is the same visual look that ultimately becomes the Empire. Wedding scene, I was going to do it two ways. One where she took his metal hand, and the other way where she took his other hand. And I ended up shooting it originally with him taking her other hand because I felt that was the kindest way. But then after seeing the movie, I decided it'd be better to have him also take her in his metal hand and have a little bit more of the Darth Vader influence. So we shot that later. It wasn't able to get into the actual film release, but it did get into the digital release and in the DVD. Films in larger groups, and I ultimately think of them as 12 hours, 6 parts. Going back and doing the backstory was an interesting challenge to me. Original Star Wars was designed to be 4, 5, and 6, and it was designed to be something you came in the middle of. I guess ultimately what I looked forward to the most in going back was the fact that I could deal with how the empire was created, how a society goes from a democratic society to a dictatorship, and at the same time contrast that with a personal story about how a good person turns bad.
Like this credit, I thought specifically that, when the credits were being done, this credit should come up first, but I haven't been able to crack that yet. No, I'm only kidding.